Now we move from constitutional philosophy to constitutional administration. And perhaps no topic represents Indian administration better than federalism. Federalism. Imagine India had only one government, one parliament, one administration, one police force, one education system, and one language policy. Would governance become easier? At first, it may appear so, but think about India, a country stretching from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, thousands of languages and dialects, different climates, different cultures, and different economic realities and developmental priorities. Can one government sitting in New Delhi understand every local problem equally well? Equally well? Probably, probably not. Now imagine the opposite extreme. Every state completely independent with its own foreign policy, with its own currency, with its own army, and with its own citizenship. Would India survive as one nation? India would India survive as one nation? Again, probably not. So the constitution had to solve an extraordinary challenge, that how do we preserve national unity without destroying regional diversity? How do we preserve national unity without destroying regional diversity? That challenge gave birth to Indian federalism. Many students define federalism as simply the division of powers between center and state. Between center and states. This is correct but incomplete. This is correct but incomplete. Division of powers between center and states. Federalism is about sharing responsibility. It recognizes that different levels of government understand different problems, because the union deals with national security, foreign affairs, currency, major economic policy, atomic energy, citizenship, etc. But comes to the states. States deal with agriculture, police, public health, public order, local administration, and local governments, local administration. And local governments will understand village roads, drainage, street lighting, drinking water, and community development. No single institution can govern India alone. So, why did the Constituent Assembly adopt a federal system with a strong center? Strong center. Remember the historical context: partition, communal violence, refugee rehabilitation, princely state integration, regional uncertainty, economic instability. So the framers in this context, the framers wanted federalism, but they also wanted national unity. So they rejected both extremes, neither complete centralization nor complete decentralization, and designed a federal constitution with certain unitary features. That is why India is often described as a union of states. States may be reorganized, boundaries may change, new states may emerge, but the union remains one. So now let us understand how this actually functions. The constitutional distributes, the constitution distributes legislative powers through three lists. Those are union list, state list, and concurrent list. The union list contains subjects requiring national uniformity like defense, foreign affairs, currency, atomic energy, and citizenship, etc. Only parliament may laws in these particular list items. Come to the state list. The state list the state list contains matters requiring local understanding like police, public order, agriculture, local government, public health, etc. In these items, in this list contains items, state legislatures only make laws. And comes to the concurrent list. Concurrent list recognizes shared responsibility. Let's say education, forest, marriage, labor, electricity, where both the union and states can legislate. Because many public problems today require cooperation rather than competition. So both legislate. But federalism is much more than constitutional lists. It is tested during crises like floods, pandemics, disasters, internal security, climate change, migration, and river disputes. In that time, no single government can handle these alone. The union needs the states, and the states need the union. That is why modern governance increasingly depends on cooperative federalism. Cooperative federalism. Cooperative federalism means coordination instead of confrontation, collaboration instead of competition, partnership instead of hierarchy. This is why institutions like GST Council, Interstate Council, Niti Ayog, and zonal councils have become increasingly important. They are platforms through which federalism actually operates. So, federalism also faces real challenges: center state disputes, the role of the governor, financial dependence, misuse of Article 356, interstate river water disputes, regional aspirations, implementation of centrally sponsored schemes, language debates, resource sharing, etc. It has challenges also, but UPSC is rarely interested in what is Article 365. It asks, has Indian federalism become more cooperative or more confrontational? They ask like these questions rather than what is Article 365 simply. They asked, Indian federalism is becoming more cooperative or more confrontational. It is evaluating analysis, not memory. So we will return to both the governor's role and Article 360, 356 in detail once we reach the executive. So modern federalism is no longer only constitutional, it is administrative. It is administrative through digital governance, climate action, public health, disaster management, artificial intelligence, cyber security, and energy transition. Every one of these requires coordination between multiple levels of government. The future civil servant must know how to coordinate institutions, not merely define them. So, comes to the answer writing part. Suppose UPSC asks, Indian federalism is becoming increasingly cooperative rather than merely constitutional. Discuss. A topper writing an answer like this explains why federalism exists, distinguishes constitutional federalism from operational federalism, uses contemporary examples such as GST Council or disaster management coordination, etc. Then critically evaluates continuing challenges and concludes with practical reforms that strengthen cooperative governance while respecting constitutional autonomy. So that is administrative thinking, exactly what UPSC rewards. Indian federalism is becoming increasingly cooperative rather than merely constitutional. This is the question. Discuss. What you have to do? Indian federalism is becoming increasingly cooperative rather than merely constitutional. Discuss. Why federalism exists, you have to explain. Then distinguish constitutional federalism from operational federalism. Then uses contemporary examples such as the GST Council or disaster management. Disaster management coordination. Then critically evaluates continuing challenges. Then concludes with practical reforms that strengthen cooperative governance while respecting constitutional autonomy. So this is the way of writing an answer. This is the administrative thinking, exactly what UPSC rewards. So let us summarize. This is not just about Articles 245 to 263. This is about how India governs diversity. Federalism is not about dividing India. It is about governing India together, not dividing, governing together. It protects diversity, strengthens democracy, improves administrative efficiency, and promotes accountability and balances national unity with regional autonomy. So the constitution did not simply divide powers. It created a partnership between the union, the states, and increasingly local governments. Power has now been distributed across this federal structure. The next question is, who actually exercises the lawmaking part of that power? Which institution represents the people, debates national issues, and holds the executive accountable? That institution is parliament, the institutional voice of constitutional democracy. Comes to the federalism part. Till now we discussed three lists: separation of powers from seventh schedule, three lists: union, state, concurrent. Then residuary powers automatically goes to union. Residuary means which is not mentioned in these three. Those items are residuary with the union. Union only have the power to make laws those issues. So comes to the cooperative federalism. GST Council we discuss, Finance Commission and Niti Ayog. Recently, we are facing recurring friction in the form of Governor Article 356 and river disputes. We will discuss these current items in the next upcoming classes in the current affairs bridge class. That is, till now we have understand how power is distributed through federalism. But who actually makes the laws? Who authorizes taxation, approves public expenditure, questions the government, and represents the voice of more than 1 billion citizens? The answer is Parliament. Imagine there is no Parliament. Tomorrow morning, the government decides to increase tax. Can it do that? Can it do that? Suppose it wants to spend 10 lakh crore rupees without approval or make a new criminal law through a press conference. Of course not. It is not possible. Why? Because in a democracy, the government does not own power. It only exercises power. The owner of power is the people. Ultimate power is the people lying with. And parliament is the institution through which the people exercise that power. Parliament is not merely a lawmaking body, it is the constitutional expression of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty. Parliament has four constitutional functions majorly, like legislation and financial control, executive accountability, and representation. Through legislation, the consultation, committee scrutiny, debate, and amendment, deliberate, not impulsive lawmaking. With this, complete legislation will happen. Then comes to financial control, budget, appropriation, financial bills, no public money spent without approval of the parliament. This is the financial powers of parliament to control the executive, and comes to the executive accountability. In the question hour, 0 hour, no confidence motions, power must answers questions. Executive executive must answers the questions. So parliament has executive accountability. And comes to representation, every member carries regional, linguistic, and community concerns into the house. So that is why parliament has four constitutional functions majorly: legislation, financial control, executive accountability, and representation. Comes to the bicameralism. Why is parliament bicameral? Why two houses and not one? Because democracy is not merely about majority rule, it is also about thoughtful lawmaking. Thoughtful lawmaking. The Lok Sabha, the Lok Sabha represents the people directly. Its legitimacy coming from the universal adult franchise. But comes to Rajya Sabha, the Rajya Sabha represents the states. Its constitutional purpose being continuity, continuity, deliberation, and federal balance. Together, they ensure legislation is both democratic and carefully examined. That is why bicameralism is needed. Every question UPSC asks about parliament eventually comes back to four functions. I'm repeating again. Those are legislation. Legislation means not merely passing bills, but consultation and a committee scrutiny, debate, first reading, second reading, debate, amendment, opposition, consensus. Every law affects millions of lives. So democratic lawmaking must be deliberate, not impulsive. So that is why legislation is primary role of the parliament. Then comes to the financial control. No democratic government can spend public money without parliament approval, without parliamentary approval. So the budget, appropriation bills, finance bills, demand for grants, and every rupee collected and spent must ultimately pass through the parliament. So taxation without representation is incompatible with constitutional democracy. And comes to the executive control and executive accountability. A government may enjoy a majority, but that does not free it from scrutiny, like question hour, zero hour, calling attention motions, and no confidence motions, parliamentary committee debates, etc. Power must always answer questions in the house. So comes to the representation part. Every member carries the concerns of citizens, different regions, different languages, different communities, and different interests into the national legislature across the country. So disagreement is not a weakness of democracy. It is one of its strengths. Disagreement through that only consultation, arguments, and then law will come into the act. So now committees comes to the parliamentary committees, an area students often ignore, which I think is a mistake, because committees reveal how modern legislatures actually function. And one more thing, UPSC is more important. UPSC is asking again and again questions from committees part. Can the entire parliament examine every bill in detail or debate technical legislation on artificial intelligence and data protection or biotechnology only on the floor? Of course, it's not possible. No, it's practically no. Committees examine, investigate, consult with experts, review, implementation, and recommend improvements, then only increasing the quality of legislation. That is why parliamentary committees is most important in the lawmaking process. So that is why UPSC asks about them, repeatedly asks about them, not because they are procedural, but because they strengthen democratic accountability. They strengthen the democratic accountability. That is why parliamentary committees is most important as far as procedural concern, as well as lawmaking process, and as well as UPSC purpose also. The contemporary challenges include, as far as parliamentary process or parliament is concerned, declining sittings, frequent disruptions, frequent urgent motions, reduced legislative scrutiny, and a growing use of ordinance, limited discussion on important bills, strengthening the anti defection framework while preserving legislative independence, and the need for greater technology use and committee reform. These are constitutional governance questions, and UPSC expects balanced analysis, not political opinion. It rarely asks what is the question, however. but rather than it asks, has Parliament effectively discharged its accountability function? They will ask like this. The contemporary challenges mainly declining sittings, disruptions, growing reliance on ordinance, limited discussion on important bills, strengthening the anti-defection framework while preserving legislative independence, and the need for greater technology use and committee reforms. So these are constitutional governance questions, and UPSC expected balanced analysis, not political opinion here. It rarely asks in this paper what is question hour, but rather than question what is question hour, UPSC asks like this: has Parliament effectively discharged its accountability function? They asked like this: Parliament is the constitutional expression of popular sovereignty. So, not merely a lawmaking body. You have to understand this. As governance becomes more complex, more complex, as governance becomes more complex, digital governance, artificial intelligence, data protection, climate legislation, cyber security, electoral reforms, economic regulation, a strong parliament becomes even more important, not less. Comes to the answer writing section. Suppose UPSC asks like this: Parliament is not merely a lawmaking institution, but the principal instrument of democratic accountability. Discuss. The answer should like this: explains parliamentary democracy and responsible government, then analyzes Parliament's legislative, financial, deliberative, and accountability roles, then evaluates present challenge with contemporary examples, and suggests reforms such as strengthening committees and improving debate quality. It evaluates Parliament as an institution of constitutional governance rather than merely describing it. In this way, you have to write an answer for this question. The question I am repeating again: Parliament is not merely a lawmaking institution, but the principal instrument of democratic accountability. Discuss. This is the question. Parliament is not merely a lawmaking institution, but the principal instrument democratic accountability. Discuss. A topper writing answer like this: explains explains first parliamentary democracy and responsible government, then analyzes parliament's legislative, financial, deliberative, and accountability roles, then evaluates present challenges with contemporary examples, and then suggests reforms such as strengthening committees and improving debate quality. So it evaluates Parliament as an institution of constitutional governance rather than merely describing. So this is the way of answer writing. Explain parliamentary democracy, then analyze parliament's roles, legislative, financial, deliberative, accountability, and present challenges with contemporary examples you have to evaluate, then suggest reforms. In this way, you have to write an answer. So let us summarize. Parliament is the constitutional situation, and Parliament is the constitutional institution through which the sovereign will of the people is translated into law. So Parliament is the constitutional institution through which the sovereign will of the people is translated into law. It authorizes public expenditure, scrutinizes the executive, and debates national priorities, represents India's diversity, and keeps democracy accountable. So without parliament, democracy becomes executive rule. So with a strong parliament, executive power remains constitutionally answerable. So you have to understand one thing very clearly. Parliament is the constitutional institution through which the sovereign will of the people is translated into law, and it authorizes public expenditure, scrutinizes the executive, debates national priorities, represents India's diversity, and keeps democracy accountable. Without parliament, democracy becomes executive rule, and with a strong parliament, executive power remains constitutionally answerable. So, however, parliament is only the half of the legislative picture. It makes laws for the union, but most of what touches a citizen's daily life is legislated much closer to home. That takes us to state legislatures, the mirror institution operating at the regional level. That is, state legislatures, democracy at the regional level. We have just finished understanding parliament, that is the national legislature. Now, but look at carefully at the syllabus wording again. It does not say parliament, it says parliament and state legislatures. So, two institutions in one sentence, and yet most students prepare only one of them. That gap is exactly where UPSC likes to test you. You have to ask yourself a simple question: health, agriculture, police, land, public order. Who legislates on these? Not parliament primarily. These are state subjects, which means the laws that actually touch a farmer's land record, a patient's local hospital, or a citizen's FIR are usually not made in New Delhi at all. They are made in state legislatures only. If you only study parliament, you are studying how the union speaks, but not how much day to day governance is actually legislated. Structurally, state legislatures mirror of the parliament, but not identically, because every state has a legislative assembly that is called as Vidhan Sabha, directly elected body. That is the this is mirrors Lok Sabha, and it is here the real political power rests. Some states additionally have a legislative council that is called as the Vidhan Parshad. Notice the word some. Why? Unlike parliament where bicameralism is fixed, a state can choose to have one house or two. Why? Because a legislative council is not identical in stature to the Rajya Sabha, not equal in stature to the Rajya Sabha. This is optional. A state chooses to have one or two. It does not enjoy equal power, and creating or abolishing one requires the state assembly itself to pass a resolution followed by parliament's law. Vidhana Parishad or legislative council does not enjoy equal power, and creating or abolishing One requires the state assembly itself to pass a resolution, then followed by parliament's law. That the single fact that is a state chooses its own bicameralism is a favorite UPSC trap because students often assumes all states functions the same way. Now, why does the legislative council matters? If powers are limited, because does the same job the Rajya Sabha does at the center, bringing in expertise, allowing nominated members, moderating hasty legislation, but at a smaller scale. And money bills, the council has almost no independent power. The council has almost no independent power on money bills. Comes to ordinary bills, it can only delay. It can only delay, not block them. That asymmetry is deliberate. The assembly, being directly elected, must remain the final word on money bills and present in every state. Functionally, state legislatures perform the same four roles we studied for parliament: legislation, financial control over the state budget, executive accountability over the state government, and the representation of regional concerns. But there is a governance nuance worth remembering because so many subjects citizens interact with daily: police, land, agriculture, municipal administration sit with the states. The effectiveness of state legislature often determines whether governance is actually felt on the ground, regardless of how well parliament functions at the center. But state legislature often determines whether governance is actually felt on the ground, regardless of how well parliament functions at the center. So contemporary issues here mirror parliaments: declining sitting days, weak committee systems in several states, disruption and increasing reliance on ordinance by state governments. UPSC rarely asks what is a Vidhan Parshad. It asks something closer to: do weaker legislative institutions at the state level undermine cooperative federalism? Connecting this scene directly back to what we studied under federalism. For answer writing, suppose UPSC asks like this: assess whether state legislatures function as effective instrument of accountability compared to the parliament. The question I am repeating again: assess whether state legislatures function as effective instruments of accountability compared to the parliament. A high scoring answer establishes the constitutional parity in role but practically asymmetry in capacity. Discuss the optional legislative council and its limited powers, and evaluates committee systems and sitting days at the state level and closes with reforms. Strengthening state committee ecosystems, capacity building, and technology adoption. So, the question is asked: comparative state legislature and parliament. So, how can you write the answer? It establishes the constitutional parity in role. Both are state legislatures as well as parliament, but practical asymmetry in capacity because their Rajya Sabha is permanent. Here, optional legislative council, and that too its limited powers as far as Vidhana Parishad at state legislature level is concerned. So come to evaluates committee. systems and sitting days at the state level are different compared to the parliament some extent. So, and closes with reforms, strengthening state committee ecosystems and capacity building and technology adoption, etc. In this way, you have to write the answer. So let us summarize. Parliament legislates for the nation. State legislatures legislate for the citizens' everyday life of the state. One without the other is an incomplete picture of Indian democracy, which is exactly why the syllabus refuses to let you study only one. That is why in the syllabus they given parliament and state legislatures. They given as one word. So, but representation itself, whether at the union or state level, depends on a prior question. How are elections actually conducted? And who is qualified to take part in them? That takes us to the law that supplies the machinery of representation of the representation. The representation of the People's Act comes to this. After Parliament and after state legislatures, we discuss the comparisons, we discuss the each and everything functions. Then we are coming to representation of the People's Act, the machinery of elections. We know parliament and state legislatures represent the people, but representation itself depends on one prior question, like how are elections actually conducted and who is qualified to contest or who is qualified to vote in them. The Constitution creates the Election Commission and guarantees universal adult franchise. But the detailed rules of the electoral game, qualifications such as qualifications, disqualifications, the conduct of elections, and election offences, and a dispute resolution, etc., etc., are laid down not in the Constitution itself. Then where? But in a law, that is the Representation of the People Act. That is the Representation of the People Act. So why does this distinction matter? Because the Constitution deliberately left electoral detail to ordinary legislation, recognizing that electoral practice would need to evolve new offenses, new technology, new forms of malpractice far more quickly than constitutional amendment allows. There are in fact two RPAs, two Representation of People Acts. One is RPA 1950 and second one is RPA 1951. RPA 1950, which deals with the preparation of electoral rolls, preparation of electoral rolls, allocation of seats, and delimitation related framework. And the Act of 1951, which deals with actual conduct of elections, qualifications and disqualifications of the candidates, election offences and dispute resolution, and a legal basis for model code of conduct. This is the machinery for resolving election disputes. The 1951 Act is where most UPSC relevant material sits, like conduct of elections, qualifications and disqualification of candidates, election offences and dispute resolution, and a legal basis for the model code of conduct. It defines who can be disqualified from contesting, conviction for certain offences, corrupt practices, failure to submit election expense accounts, and it created the legal basis for the model code of conduct. More serious provisions. It is also the law under which an election can be challenged in court through an election petition, and under which a sitting member can be unseated for a corrupt practice. Let me simply saying this: RPA 1950 and RPA 1951, these two acts, one machinery for elections in the country, Representation of the People Act. In RPA 1950, consists of preparation of electoral rolls, allocation of seats, and delimitation related work. Comes to RPA 1951, conduct of elections, qualification and disqualification of candidates, elections offences and dispute resolution, and a legal basis for the model code of conduct. But these are not presented in the election and a constitution not itself. These are in the RPAs only. With this, based on this, the elections happening, particularly regarding identification, qualification, disqualification of candidates. This matters for GS-II because it connects two chapters you have already studied. So it is the practical machinery through which the election commission, the constitutional body, we will meet again in the chapter on institutional bodies, actually exercises its function. And its reform debates are almost always federalism and accountability debates in disguise. Should conviction lead to immediate disqualification or only after appeals are exhausted? Should candidates with pending criminal cases be barred from contesting? Should there be state funding of elections to reduce dependence on undisclosed money? UPSC does not test the section numbers of the Act. It tests whether you can connect electoral law reform to the larger question of clean and accountable representation. So reform debates are almost always federalism and accountability debates. Should conviction lead to immediate disqualification or only after appeals are exhausted? Should candidates with pending criminal cases be barred from contesting? Should there be state funding of elections to reduce dependence on disclosed money? UPSC does not test the section numbers of the Act. It tests whether you can connect electoral law reform to the larger question of clean and accountable representation. Comes to answer writing, suppose UPSC asks, electoral reforms are necessary to preserve the integrity of India's representative democracy. Discuss with reference to the Representation of the People Act. This is the question. What should be the answer? In the first instances, after reading the question, what you have to do is explains the constitutional basis of electoral law, distinguishes the 1950 and 51 acts, then discuss disqualification under their limitations provisions and their limitations, particularly around the criminalization of politics, evaluates recent reform proposals, and conclude with a balanced view on strengthening electoral integrity without diluting the presumption of innocence. So the question is, electoral reforms are necessary to preserve the integrity of India's representative democracy. Discuss with reference to the Representation of the People Act. This is the question. High scoring answer why look like this. Explains the constitutional basis for electoral law, distinguishes the 1950 and 1951 acts, then discusses disqualification provisions and their limitations, particularly around criminalization of politics. Answer should be around this, particularly around criminalization of politics, evaluates recent reform proposals, and concludes with a balanced view on strengthening electoral integrity without diluting the presumption of innocence. So let us summarize. The Constitution guarantees the right to vote. The, the Representation of the People Act supplies the machinery that makes that right meaningful in practice. Without it, universal adult franchise would remain a constitutional promise with no way to actually deliver a free and fair election. So, elections, however, are only the formal periodic channel of representation. But democracy does not pass between elections, and neither does citizen participation. That continuous informal channel is the work of pressure groups. So then comes to the pressure groups and formal and informal associations. This is till now we discussed RPA 1951 and RPA 1950 and electoral reforms and how election commission based on working few RPA acts regarding model code of conduct and qualification and disqualification of candidates, etc. Then one last piece completes our picture of how the people's voice actually reaches the institution we have studied. That is, elections happen once every 5 years, but citizens do not stop participating in democracy between elections. Through they organize, they lobby, they protest, and they advocate continuously. That continuous non-electoral form of participation is the work of pressure groups. What exactly is a pressure group? Unlike a political party, pressure group does not seek to capture power or contest elections. It seeks to influence the exercise of power by lobbying legislators, mobilizing public opinion, filing litigation, or organizing protest like trade unions, industry associations like CII or FICCI, farmer organizations, professional bodies of doctors or lawyers, environmental groups, and civil society organizations. Hmm? All functions are pressure groups, each representing a specific interest and pushing it into the policy conversation. Why does the Constitution not mention pressure groups at all? And the syllabus explicitly names them because their role is sociological and political rather than strictly constitutional. But their effect on governance is very real. Think back to the directive principles of fundamental rights we studied earlier. When a labor union pushes for strong workplace safety law or an environmental group litigates against a polluting project, they are effectively processing the state to fulfill constitutional commitments that citizens alone cannot enforce individually. So UPSC interest here is almost always comparative and evaluative rather than descriptive. Like, do pressure groups strengthen democracy by ensuring diverse voices are heard between elections, or do they distort policy making by giving disproportionate influence to well resourced, organized interests over the unorganized poor? Both answers are defensible, and a strong response acknowledges the tension rather than picking one side absolutely. Formal associations like registered trade unions, chambers of commerce, professional bodies tend to have institutionalized access to policymakers, while informal groups like spontaneous citizen movements, unregistered collectives, farmer and environmental protests relies on public mobilization and media attention. This scene also connects directly back to the parliament and executive because parliamentary committees regularly consult pressure groups and experts during bill scrutiny. The very committee process we studied earlier, ministries conduct public consultations before finalizing major policies. Pressure groups are, in the last sense, and in that sense, an informal but continuous input into the institution that otherwise only respond to citizens one every 5 years at the ballot box. Comes to answer writing, suppose UPSC asks pressure groups perform an important function in a representative democracy, but the influence raises questions of equity and accountability. Discuss. Answer like this. Explain what distinguishes a pressure group from a political party. Then discuss their role in policy input between elections. Evaluates the equity concern around organized versus unorganized interests, and suggests how transparency mechanisms such as mandated disclosure of lobbying activity could balance influence with accountability. In this way, you have to write an answer. So let us summarize. Democracy does not pass between elections, and neither does citizen participation. Pressure groups are continuous informal machinery through which that participation reaches parliament, the executive, and public policy, completing the picture of representation that elections alone cannot provide. So representation in all its forms, parliament, whether state legislature, whether elections, and whether continuous citizen advocacy, ultimate produces laws, priorities, and demands. But none of this changes anything on the ground until someone converts into it action. That responsibility belongs to the executive, the administrative engine of the Indian state. So, till now we discussed regarding parliament representation, etc. Comes to the parliament, four functions we have discussed: legislation, finance, accountability, and representation. Then comes to state legislatures, mirror parliament but not identical in power. Then again comes to RPA 1950 and 51, and the machinery behind universal franchise, and one thing regarding qualification, disqualification of candidates, and model code of conduct, etc. And comes to the pressure groups. This is a formal and informal participation between the elections we discussed regarding as far as pressure groups is concerned. In the making of laws, it will be useful. And one takeaway is finally the representation is continuous, not just once every 5 years when you are going to the ballot box, rather EVM, etc.